Hey everyone, thanks for joining my video today, and this is Sam again, and it's been a while since I've recorded a video, so we'll see how this one goes, but I'm excited for today's topic. Today I'm going to be talking about miracles, and specifically David and Goliath, but I wanted to kind of just do some housekeeping issues because I have a, like I was talking about, I always talk about in my videos, like these videos are kind of spur of the moment ideas that I have, sometimes because I'm inspired by something I read or something I've seen or just something that I want to talk about. So like when I come on to these videos, I'm not always prepared, and I'm not saying that to say like, look how much I know off the top of my head, because sometimes I do struggle to make my point. But anyways, this one I think is like an interesting topic to me. And so I think it kind of deals with naturalism and the way the world sees the Bible, the way the secular world, I should say, sees the Bible as being a book of fairy tales. And I remember having a conversation with somebody who I love very much years ago, and talking about miracles and can they happen, and why she doesn't believe the Bible, or like the Immaculate Conception or the Incarnation or the Resurrection, or all the way back to the accounts in Genesis for that matter. And it comes from a conditioning and a pre-programming that is pushed into us to reject the spiritual notions of supernatural or preternatural reality, so that we can agree that the things that we see are real, the things we can touch, taste, see, and feel, are what constitute our notion of reality. And what the Bible is claiming is that there is another part, or multiple other parts, of what we know and what we see. There are things working behind the scenes. The Bible talks about that there are angels and demons, that there is a God who created and ordered not only the universe but the heavens, heaven itself, which is unseen, where there are actually creatures and other beings that we aren't able to see unless they manifest themselves to us. And this all makes sense to me. It takes a little bit of thinking through, but when we consider that there are other aspects of reality that we haven't completely understood yet through technology or science, such as the mind, consciousness, things like laws, morality, why societies, nations are structured the way they are, etc. Well, we could go on indefinitely about that, but there are things that we can't really understand, like time, but they exist, like gravity. They exist, and they keep everything in a perpetual order. So those things kind of show that there is a limitation to what we are able to understand and know. And when we think about human consciousness, and animal consciousness for that matter, I'm not discrediting that animals are conscious and sentient, obviously, but there are implications of that, and that, I think that shows that it's kind of hard to think of like mind creating itself, or even matter creating itself for that matter. The universe kind of coming from nothing, with no directing intelligence. No. So basically all I'm trying to say is, we can get into this kind of more theistic versus atheistic dichotomy, but if we take into account that there is more behind the story, there's more to the story than what we're told by our culture nowadays, which is what the Hebrews saw. They knew the story behind the scenes, and they knew it was real. They lived it. So anyways, this is kind of my preface to the discussion. But they lived this, and today we live in the world where we see, where it tells us that the things we can touch, taste, see, and feel, that's all there is. That's all we'll ever know. This life is where everything is contained, and there's nothing outside of it. And I think that is, I mean, it makes sense for a moment, but when we really do a deep dive of what that implies, it means that there is technically no meaning. Even our rights and consciousness itself are simply illusions. So I think that's a strange thought, but it's very common and popular. It's the most popular version of reality. And people who hold those beliefs are oftentimes very good, very moral people who I respect a lot. But I think lots of times, especially for my part, because when I was an agnostic or an atheist, I didn't really think through consistently what my beliefs led to. So I guess all I'm trying to say is, like, if there is a God, then everything in the Bible is possible. If there is no God, then it's not all possible. So where both the Christian or the Jew and the atheist are coming in with two opposing predispositions that are operating apart from whatever the evidence is for or against the Bible, we're coming in with a predisposition. The Christian's coming in with the predisposition that there is a God who ordered and structured everything, who is able to intervene and to do things in our reality because he actually created and ordered that reality, versus the predisposition that there is no God and everything came about without any sort of structure or any sort of guiding intelligence, and that everything evolved into what it is now. So those are the two predispositions that we're coming with. So with those two ideas intact, let's just go in and look at the story of David and Goliath. So David and Goliath is a story where you have two opposing armies. You have the Israelites and the Philistines across from one another. And the Philistine have a giant man, a giant warrior, who comes out onto the battlefield. I think I'm just kind of doing this from recollection, but he comes out on the battlefield day after day and taunts the Israelite army and makes them fear. Because I think at that point, instead of the armies going to battle and there being massive casualties, oftentimes they would pit their greatest warriors against each other, and whoever would win that battle would essentially win the battle for the entire army, and it would be seen as a victory for the army. So basically the Philistines have this giant who is, and obviously this story has a ton of symbolism and a ton of meaning that people oftentimes like to project onto their own lives and say, like, who is the Goliath in your life, etc. But and so I think that's one of the reasons why it's oftentimes mythologized. So anyways, okay, it's often mythologized because there is symbolism behind it. But I think that in our own lives, there's oftentimes symbolism behind it. But anyways, that was a tangent. So so basically, Goliath comes out, confronts the Israelite army, taunts them day after day. The Israelite army is afraid. They don't think that anybody is, I mean, first of all, they don't have anybody of that size who is able to face off with Goliath. So eventually David comes out, and we all know the story. He comes out and slings a rock at Goliath. It penetrates his head like a bullet would if he shot. It'd be like somebody with a sword and I came out with a gun and shot him, right? So it doesn't matter how big the person is at that point. David just comes out and swings a stone and hits him in the head. So I think the way I always understood that story is that like what David did was impossible apart from the work of God. Which very well might be the case. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us the dimensions. It doesn't tell us every dynamic of the story. It doesn't tell us like how far David stood away from Goliath. Did David stand 20 feet? Did David stand 200 feet away from Goliath and swing the stone? My guess is that he was pretty close to Goliath, because the closer he is, the better his aim will be. But I think David was very experienced with this weapon, which this is something Malcolm Gladwell also talked about in his book on the subject, David and Goliath. But and I think like a lot of people look at this question like, well, if you're taking out God's miraculous power of the equation, and David just has a really good weapon, and through his military mindfulness, with his military experience, and knowing that he has killed other animals that threatened the flock as a shepherd, he understood how to walk in and attack Goliath in a way that Goliath was not expecting, and destroy this fearsome enemy with ease, because he was breaking out of the conventions of what the military was expecting at that point. In a sense, you could say he was kind of cheating, because he wasn't going up into hand-to-hand combat. He was going up and swinging a stone at David, and it sunk into his head. And David fell to the ground. So people don't believe this story that David was, first of all, a giant, because they say giants don't exist. Well, if you look at the Bible, I think it says the size of David was maybe like 9 feet or something. I can't remember. But there have been people in our history who have been really big, who have had I can't remember the condition, but they're much larger than you and I are. So these things do fall into the range of possibility. And like this story is something that has been preserved for thousands of years. I think about 3,000 years. And I think that's an interesting concept when we're considering whether or not it really happened. And so where do I land on like what God's role it was in this? Because I'm not saying at all that David had tremendous courage going out and facing this man, this monster, and taking him down kind of with ease. And I think, especially as a Christian, like, we can completely secularize the story and it still be true, right? Like, we can say, hey, David just was really courageous, and he goes out and he swings a stone at David, or at Goliath, and Goliath dies. But I think the more comprehensive version of the story, especially looking at the entire Bible and the way God works, and the way God works in David's life, and the way God weaves patterns and stories together throughout the entire Bible, is that God was the active agent, kind of pushing David to the center of the stage of Israel, and pushing him forward into who he was going to be for Israel. And so it was God's whether or not God like actually took the rock out of his sling and made it aim at Goliath's head, it doesn't really matter at that point, because God's providence is already at play. So that was kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about with David and Goliath, and thinking about the conversation that I had with somebody in my past who doesn't believe that story ever happened. there are a lot of good reasons to believe why it did happen. And then, if it did happen, what does that mean for the rest of the Bible? If we can verify something like that as being likely a historical account that was well preserved in the Bible, what does that mean for the way that we see all of the Bible, all of Christianity, and Jewish history and tradition? I think it has tremendously positive implications for how we view the Old Testament and the New Testament, for that matter. So, anyways, the next thing I wanted to talk about is like the impossible happening nowadays. So I believe miracles do happen nowadays, but I also believe like things that are really unlikely happen all the time. If I was to go and interview you and 10 other people about the most impossible thing that has ever happened in their lives, I would get some amazing, incredible stories that people wouldn't think are true. For me, I know I have stories like that I would tell people, and it seems impossible. Now, if I was to write those stories in a book, those 10 stories, and entitle the book 10 Impossible Stories from the Modern Age, and then put them in a box, bury it under the dirt, and then those stories were to be uncovered 3,000 years from now, I wonder how the people would view those stories. Would they view them as history or myth? I think it would be wise for us to consider that the stories in the Bible, I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, but I think even for people who don't believe in the Bible completely, to think about what was the intention of these authors when they were relating this history in Scripture and preserving it for people who would be reading it thousands of years in the future. So anyways, I hope this video was helpful to somebody out there. I'm going to cut it off here, but take care and God bless.